I invited my wife to the special couples party, and she said, "I'm sorry, but I'm going with my boss," and in that sentence, my heart learned what the end meant. I didn't insist, just wore my silence and left before the party started. "Don't worry, you don't have to justify anything anymore," I replied. She believed there was a future in that detour, but soon discovered it was just a distraction for him. Alone, she tried to rebuild what she'd broken. I moved on, finding a new love with a calm gaze and non-negotiable respect. When she came to me, full of regret, I offered what was left, forgiveness. Not to get back together, but so each of us could move on with our choices. I with the peace I'd found, she with the absence she'd created. It never happens overnight. The death of a love is made up of small withdrawals, of looks that grow emptier, of words that become formalities. I hadn't realized that her "good night" no longer carried the same warmth. The scent of her hair still lingered on the pillow, but her soul had already moved on. There were no screams. No explicit betrayal. Not at first. Just a cruel slowness in her gestures. A kiss on the forehead instead of the mouth. And "I'm tired" that always coincided with any attempt at connection. And when I asked if she wanted to go with me to the company couples party, hoping to perhaps rekindle some spark, she looked at me with an almost impatient weariness. "I'm sorry, but I'm going with my boss." That was it. No hesitation. No shame. As if it were just a scheduling adjustment. I smiled on the outside. But something died inside. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't question. I just rummaged through my pocket, grabbed my keys, and said in the driest voice I'd ever heard, "Don't worry, you don't have to justify anything anymore." And she didn't. She left the room as if returning from a trivial conversation. She didn't look at me again that night. I watched her through the reflection in the window. She hurriedly applied her makeup, as if she still had something to conquer. And indeed, she believed it. She believed there was a future in that distraction. That what she felt was passion, not escape. That she was exchanging a stagnant relationship for a new lease on life. And who am I to stop a leap of faith? But the part that's never told in clandestine romance movies is what comes after. The awkward silences. The emptiness that can't be filled with hurried kisses. The regret that arrives on ordinary days, when no one is looking. Because unlike her, I kept going. I fell. I got up. And I learned that peace has a name, a scent, a presence. I discovered a love that didn't demand daily proof of my worth, that didn't compare me to anyone, that laughed at my bad jokes and cried with me when I missed those who had passed. And when chance, or fate, crossed our paths again, she was alone. Tired. Less haughty. With the heavy eyes of someone who hasn't slept well in a long time. She said she thought of me every night. That she made a mistake. That the other person wasn't who she thought. That I was home. But I had already moved on. The cruelest thing about betrayal is that the betrayer believes they can return. That the door that closed still creaks when pushed. But sometimes, love shatters like glass, it shatters. She came to me with red eyes and a low voice. "I know I don't deserve it, but, is there still time to return?" And in that moment, my silence was no longer a shield. It was an answer. Because when you find a new love that heals you without patching you up, that welcomes you without charging you for every scar, you understand that what happened no longer needs to be redone. Only remembered with the lightness of someone who has forgiven. I waited for you when it hurt. Now, it doesn't hurt anymore. And for that very reason, I'm not coming back. That's what I said. Calmly. Without resentment. Because true forgiveness doesn't scream. It simply doesn't need to stay anymore. She cried. From the pain. From the longing. From the knowledge that she had traded the essential for the immediate. And in that cry there was no scandal, only truth. The same truth she had denied for months. That it wasn't about the boss. Or me. It was about her. About her escape. And about the price of leaving one house thinking the other would be warmer. But the worst part was yet to come. And even she couldn't imagine how much. Because there was a letter. One last letter. That I wrote on the day of the party. A letter I never delivered. Where I told her that, despite everything, I still loved her. That I saw something in her that perhaps even she didn't see anymore. That I was willing to start over. But that, if she truly decided to go with him, I wouldn't wait for her again. That my love for her was enormous, but not infinite. The letter was forgotten in a drawer. Until, ironically, she found it. Too late. She read every line like someone listening to a last childhood song. Knowing that you'll never hear that melody the same way again. She lives alone now. Not because no one wants her. But because no one knows her like I did. And me? I move on. Alongside someone who understands what it's like to be chosen every day. Who doesn't need to leave home to feel alive. Who looks into my eyes and sees beyond the routine, the fatigue, the imperfections. And the woman who was once my world is now just a story. One that hurts to tell. But needs to be told. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't forgiving the person who betrayed you. It's accepting that you still love the person who destroyed you inside. And yet, choosing not to go back. Because if love is real, it also knows how to leave when it's no longer welcome. What she didn't know, is that time heals, but it also teaches. And sometimes, the greatest lesson comes when there's no longer time to start over. But there's one detail she doesn't know. One that might change everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or condone any form of cheating. All stories told are fictional, but based on deep emotional realities, created to show how infidelity destroys homes, trusts and entire futures. The moral behind each plot is clear: cheating is never worth it. Get ready now for a story shocking, emotional and unforgettable. Buckle up, the truth will hurt. He met her on an ordinary day, one of those days when life seems to follow its predictable flow. It was a sultry June afternoon when their eyes first met, without any grandiose promise, without background music or poetry. Just two strangers with stories yet to be told to each other. But in that instant, something inside him shifted, as if time had stopped a second longer than necessary. She smiled. And it wasn't an exaggerated smile, one calculated to impress. It was simple, genuine, almost shy. That's how his world began to revolve around her, even before he realized it. Her name was Emma. A woman with soft gestures, a calm voice, and a gentle way of observing the world around her. She had a rare talent for transforming everyday life into something enchanting. She made colorful grocery lists, folded clothes like a letter, and watered plants as if she were sharing secrets. He, in turn, was Noah. An introspective, methodical man, full of silences, but with a firm, honest gaze that exuded confidence. He worked with systems, spending much of his day in front of screens and numbers, but when he was with her, his rigidity melted away. Emma was everything he didn't know he needed. And together, they created their own rhythm, an invisible dance between the chaos of the world and the tranquility of what was theirs alone. The apartment where they lived was small, but full of intimate details. There were post-it notes with silly messages on the fridge, pillows crumpled from so many late-night conversations, and an antique coffee maker inherited from his grandfather that they insisted on keeping despite the noise it made. The neighbors always commented on how beautiful it was to see them coming home together, laughing about something only they understood. They weren't a couple of surface appearances. They were a partnership. They shared bills, dreams, anxiety attacks, boring Sundays, and rainy Mondays. They had their differences, of course. Emma was more impulsive, dreamy, sometimes impatient with his emotional slowness. Noah was pragmatic, observant, and had difficulty dealing with sudden changes. But they complemented each other in that imperfect dance that only those who truly love understand. He loved her with the calm of someone who wants to stay. She loved him with the intensity of someone who fears loss. Time passed. Dating became marriage, marriage became routine, and routine, inevitably, began to take hold. At first, they celebrated every small victory together: the car purchase, the new paint job in the living room, the cake that turned out perfectly on Sunday afternoon. But after a few years, these achievements became just part of the whole. They didn't stop loving each other, but they began to grow accustomed to each other, like someone who grows accustomed to the smell of a house after a while. There was affection, there was respect, but there was also too much silence between one word and the next. Emma began to wonder if this was truly the final destination of their love or just a way station where they had unwittingly stopped. Noah, for his part, struggled to keep things together. He paid the bills on time, fixed the broken things, remembered birthdays and important dates. He just didn't realize she expected more than maintenance. She expected involvement. She expected surprise. They tried. Dinners on random dates, short weekend trips, new series to watch together. But something was slipping through the cracks of time, something they could no longer hold together. It wasn't a lack of love. It was wear and tear. Emma found herself looking at Noah and missing him even when he was right beside her. And he, sensing the subtle distance, preferred not to ask. He thought it was a phase, that it would pass. Like all the difficult phases they had overcome. Because their love, he thought, was stronger than any storm. Emma began spending more time away from home. She embarked on a new professional project that required dedication, nightly meetings, and events. Noah, understanding as always, supported her. Never the controlling type, he trusted her with the naturalness of someone who knows the value of the woman at his side. But inside him, something was beginning to bother him. It wasn't jealousy. It was absence. The bed seemed colder, the sofa wider, the silence heavier. Emma was different. More distant, more distracted, more impatient. Conversations were limited to practical matters: bills, schedules. The sparkle in her eyes was no longer for him. And yet, he tried. A surprise dinner on a Wednesday, a note left on the mirror, an invitation to a walk in the park where they used to hold hands. Small gestures that, little by little, began to be met with a mixture of surprise and guilt on her part. She still smiled, but it was a tired smile. He still held her, but he felt she was 1,000 miles away, even in the most intimate moments. And yet, he didn't give up. Because there was still love. And he believed that love, when true, is patient. It doesn't require immediate proof. It simply waits for the right time to blossom again. But what he didn't know, and perhaps she didn't fully know either, was that there was something breaking inside. A kind of disconnect that spreads like a crack in glass. Invisible at first, but fatal over time. Emma, meanwhile, struggled with an emptiness she couldn't explain. She loved Noah. She was sure of it. But she missed feeling alive. She lacked emotion, surprise, intensity. I was starting to wonder if the problem was her. If there was something wrong with wanting more. Or if this was simply the natural end of love after so long. I tried not to think too much, but I felt it. And feelings, no matter how much we try to stifle them, eventually find their way out. She still made him coffee in the morning, but in a hurry. She still asked how his day was, but without really expecting an answer. She still said, "I love you," but without the real weight of the phrase. And Noah, although he noticed all this, pretended not to see it. Out of fear. Out of attachment. Out of love. He thought that one day everything would go back to the way it was before. That maybe they just needed some time apart. That a trip would solve the problem, that the end of a cycle at her job would bring back the calm of the old days. He didn't understand that what was missing wasn't time, it was connection. In the eyes of others, they remained the perfect couple. No scandals, no public arguments, no clear signs of crisis. But inside that house, the sound of cutlery hitting the plate was louder than any conversation. And the most painful thing of all was knowing that love still existed. But love alone, sometimes, isn't enough. It needs to be cultivated, watered, and nurtured. And they had been stagnant for too long. One day, Noah decided to prepare something special. A surprise. He discovered there was a couple's party being thrown by a mutual friend, and thought it would be the perfect chance to rekindle something between them. He chose the date, made the reservation, and thought of every detail. He arrived home with a shy smile, holding the invitation in his hand, like someone offering a flower on a winter's day. And when he told her the news, he expected a sparkle in her eyes, an excited reaction, a "Great, let's go." But what he received was silence. And then, a sentence that would change everything. But that is another part of the story. The invitation to the couple's party sat on the table for days, almost like a silent reminder of what could still be saved. Noah, unsure whether to insist or retreat, stared at that piece of paper like someone facing an opportunity and a sentence at the same time. He tried to believe that perhaps that night could rekindle something, break the coldness that had settled between them like an invisible wall. Emma, however, seemed distant. She avoided the subject with vague answers, looked away, changed the subject. When she finally decided to talk about the party, it was neutral, almost apathetic. She said she didn't know if she could go, that work was demanding, that there might be an important event that day. He simply nodded, trying to hide the pang of disappointment. He didn't want to be insistent, didn't want to turn love into a demand. But inside him, something was beginning to crack. The following days passed slowly, marked by increasingly long absences and increasingly generic excuses. Emma arrived late, often after midnight, with the same old story: meetings, deliverables, deadlines. Her cell phone was always face down on the table, a habit he'd never seen before. Noah wasn't a man of suspicion. He believed in people's sincerity, especially hers. But the small changes, the different perfume, the hastily answered messages, the distant look in her eyes even when they were together, began to form an uncomfortable mosaic. Still, he fought the urge to doubt. He wanted to believe their love was stronger than the shadows beginning to grow between them. Sometimes I'd try to talk. I'd ask if everything was okay, if there was anything he could do. Emma would smile slightly, saying she was just tired, that she needed some time. And he believed her. Or at least, he pretended to believe her. Because the fear of hearing the truth was greater than the desire to find out. I'd rather live with the uncertainty than the pain of confirmation. Still, his heart already knew. I could feel it in his gestures, in his pauses, in the words that no longer came with the same tenderness. That week, Noah came home early. He wanted to prepare something special, even without a special date. He bought wine, remade her favorite lasagna recipe, and lit candles like they had in the first months of their marriage. The clock struck 8:30 when the food began to get cold. At 9, he sent a short text, "Is everything okay?" The reply came only after 10, "Sorry, the meeting ran long. Don't wait for me." He took a deep breath and blew out the candles, one by one. The silence that filled the house that night was so dense it felt alive. Weekends, once full of plans, became days of waiting. Emma always had commitments, a course, a get-together, coffee with colleagues. Noah tried to fill the time with anything: morning runs, movies, books he never finished. But nothing distracted the emptiness growing inside him. Sometimes, I'd look over to her side of the bed and see only cold sheets. I'd start to miss even the way she'd complain about the little things: the noise of the television, the wet towel, the overly strong coffee. Now, everything was silence and absence. One night, while tidying her room, something fell from the pocket of her coat hanging on the back of the door. It was a simple, folded note with a handwritten sentence: "I loved last night. I can't wait to do it again." His stomach churned. The paper trembled between his fingers. The world, for a moment, went silent. His mind screamed, but his body remained still. There was no signature, no name, just that sentence, simple, cruel, definitive. He sat on the edge of the bed and remained there for long minutes, trying to breathe. He considered confronting her, but something inside him urged calm. He needed to understand, needed to see with his own eyes before destroying what was left. The following days were filled with calculated silence. He didn't mention the note, didn't change his behavior, just observed. He began to notice details he'd previously ignored, her nervousness when answering her cell phone, the way she overdressed for simple appointments, the new perfume that wasn't her usual. Every detail, a fresh wound. Emma seemed uncomfortable under his gaze, as if she knew something had changed but didn't have the courage to ask what. On Saturday, she mentioned she had a work dinner. She said she didn't know when to be back. He simply nodded. He waited for the sound of the car to drive away, took a deep breath, and grabbed his coat. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, maybe just an answer. He followed his instinct. And his instinct led him to a discreet restaurant downtown. There she was. Smiling. The kind of smile he hadn't seen in months. Facing her, a man. The conversation was light, the gestures intimate, her gaze, alive. For the first time in a long time, she seemed happy. And that, paradoxically, was what destroyed him the most. He stood on the other side of the street, unmoving, unblinking, as if time had stopped again, but this time, cruelly. The rain began to fall lightly, but he didn't notice. He watched, silently, what his heart already knew. She leaned over, touched the other man's hand, and for a moment, laughed in a way he could never forget. The sound of her laughter mixed with the sound of the rain was what stuck in his memory. When he finally returned home, the clock was already past midnight. The lights were off, the smell of reheated lasagna still in the air. He sat in the same chair where he'd been waiting for her for weeks. His phone vibrated, it was a text from her, "Coming soon, love." He closed the screen without responding. There was nothing more to say. When she walked into the house a few hours later, he pretended to be asleep. The scent of a strange perfume still lingered in the air. She carefully removed her shoes, perhaps so as not to wake him, and went straight to the bathroom. Noah heard the sound of running water, and it pierced him like a blade. He wanted to get up, ask questions, scream, but he couldn't. He remained motionless, staring at the ceiling, feeling his heart pound silently. In the following days, his behavior changed. Not with resentment, but with distance. He started waking up earlier, going for runs, staying out longer. Emma noticed. She tried to make conversation, but he responded with disconcerting serenity. She, who until then had seemed confident in her choices, began to feel something she hadn't expected, guilt. The glow of her previous relationship began to fade in Noah's calm gaze, which now mirrored what she had destroyed. Their wedding anniversary was approaching. He bought flowers, more out of habit than hope. He handed them to her with a brief smile. She thanked him, moved, unsure of what to make of his gesture. There was tenderness there, but also farewell. And for the first time, she began to realize the true weight of what she was losing. But the couple's party was approaching, and she had another promise. She said she already had a commitment that day, one she couldn't cancel. Noah just nodded. No questions, no protests. And in that lack of reaction, Emma felt her world crumble. Because his silence hurt more than any scream. On the night of the party, he was ready, wearing the suit she always said she liked. He waited a while, but he knew she wouldn't show up. And when the phone rang, he already knew what he would hear. "Excuse me, but I'm going with my boss." It was like that, bluntly, without hesitation. And in that moment, something in him broke completely. He took a deep breath, swallowed the lump in his throat, and simply replied, "Don't worry, you don't have to justify anything anymore." She remained silent on the other end, perhaps not understanding the weight of those words. He hung up the phone, donned silence, and left the house before the party started. There was nothing more to insist on, nothing more to explain. His heart had learned what the end was. And hers, still unaware, was about to learn what it was like to lose everything. Emma didn't sleep that night. She lay beside him, her body facing the wall, feeling the distance between them become an abyss, even though they shared the same mattress. Noah hadn't said a word since he'd returned from the party, and that hurt more than any argument she could imagine. His silence was absolute, as if all attempts to stay connected had ended there, in that moment. And she knew. She knew she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. There was something different in his eyes, a kind of resigned peace that hurt more than hatred. For the first time, she feared truly losing him. And it paralyzed her. The next morning, he woke before sunrise. He showered in silence, dressed calmly, and made coffee just for himself. She heard the sounds from the kitchen and the clink of his cup on its saucer. There was no rush in his movements, no coldness. Just absence. When he got up and entered the kitchen, he found her plate empty, her glass still on the drainer. He glanced at her for a brief moment, as if recognizing an old acquaintance, and then went back to fiddling with his phone. The lack of any emotion on his face struck her in a way she hadn't expected. It was as if she were no longer there. As if she had ceased to exist for him. Emma tried to make conversation, but he nodded in response. She commented on the weather, on a car repair, but Noah just nodded, unresponsive. There was no anger, no rudeness. Just a complete freeze. Then, in a burst of suppressed desperation, she blurted out that perhaps it would be best if they talked about what was happening. He looked at her for a long second and said in a low, calm voice that there was nothing more to say. Her stomach churned. She expected an outburst, a question, any reaction that would show he still had feelings. But what she found was a man who had decided to move on without her. The day passed in silence, and at dusk, Noah left the house without saying where he was going. Emma sat on the couch, staring at the closed door, trying to understand how things had gotten this way. She thought about calling, apologizing, explaining, but something inside her told her it was pointless. That it might already be too late. When he returned, hours later, his eyes were serene but definitive. He carried an envelope. He handed it to her and said simply that there was something she needed to read. She opened it with trembling hands. It was a letter. The first words made her throat dry. It was his handwriting. A letter written weeks earlier, on the day of the wedding. He described how much he still loved her, how much he had tried to keep their marriage alive even when everything seemed to be growing dark. He spoke of the memories he cherished, of the silent promises he made every time he held her hand, even on difficult days. And then, in a short paragraph, he said that this letter would only be delivered if she chose another path. And that if she was reading it, it was because he had finally understood that love cannot stand alone. At the end of the letter was a sentence that cut Emma to the core: I loved you completely. And for that very reason, I must go completely. She couldn't hold back her tears. She fell to the floor, sitting on the floor, as if her body couldn't bear the weight of the words. Noah stood watching her, calm, almost distant. She tried to explain, tried to say it had been a mistake, that it all happened in a moment of weakness, that she'd never stopped loving him. He just listened, his expression a mix of pain and clarity. And then, finally, he spoke. He said he didn't hate her. That he would never hate her. But that she had made a decision, and every choice comes with a consequence. Emma sobbed, saying it meant nothing, that the other man wasn't him, that she realized too late she had lost herself. Noah, with a firm and compassionate tone, replied that forgiveness is an act of liberation, but that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. That he could forgive her, yes, but he couldn't start over there. Because the love he felt deserved rest, not struggle. Silence fell between them again, but this time there was no more room for promises. Emma wept breathlessly, and Noah approached, knelt before her, and held her hand for a few seconds. He told her she would always be a part of his story, but that now they needed to go their separate ways. She hugged him tightly, as if trying to mend everything that had been broken. But he didn't hug her back. He just kept his hands on the ground, staring straight ahead. The next morning, Emma woke up alone. His suitcase was gone from the bedroom. The clothes on the left side of the closet, the perfume on the dresser, the pair of shoes beside the bed, everything was gone. Only a note remained on the dining table: "I wish you peace. And may you find a love that you don't have to hurt to understand is real." She spent the next few days wandering the house like someone searching for a ghost. Nothing seemed to make sense. Things were the same, but his presence had evaporated. Little by little, the realization began to sink in. The other man's messages became more spaced out. The promises that once seemed enthusiastic began to fade. Emma tried to rekindle the relationship, as if it could fill the hole Noah had left. But what she found was coldness, excuses, and distance. Her former brilliance turned to indifference. And over time, she realized she had never been a priority for that man. It was merely an escape. A temporary distraction. The nights became silent and lonely. The food lost its flavor, the room seemed too big, the mirror reflected a reflection filled with regret. And then, one gray afternoon, she knew. He had gotten married. A mutual friend had posted a discreet, simple photo with a caption about new beginnings and true love. His gaze in the image was serene, light, unlike anything she had ever seen before. And beside him, a woman with a calm expression, looking at him as if she knew exactly the value of that love. But what broke Emma inside came later. A few months passed, and by chance, they met. It was in a bookstore, among quiet aisles. She saw him first, standing in front of a shelf of romance novels, with a boy beside him. The boy called out to him enthusiastically, and Noah smiled with a tenderness she knew well. When he turned and saw her, time seemed to stand still. She, unsure of what to do, simply watched. Noah approached gently, and they exchanged a polite greeting. She tried to hide her nervousness, commenting something about the weather, and he responded calmly. He looked at her as if looking at a memory. Without resentment, but without longing. Then the boy ran up to him and pulled him by the hand, saying he wanted to show him a book. Noah bent down, listened carefully, and replied, "Come on, Liam." And in that instant, Emma felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Liam. The name she always dreamed of giving the son she never had with him. The name she used to repeat aloud, imagining what it would be like to hold him in her arms, what it would be like to watch him grow. The name Noah said he loved too, and that if they ever became parents, it would be the name of their first child. She swallowed, trying to maintain her composure. Noah looked at her with an unreadable expression. Before she could say anything, the boy called out to him again, and he just smiled. Emma tried to ask, mumbled something, but he simply replied calmly, "He's my son now." Really? It wasn't blood. It was love. It was choice. It was a new beginning with someone who chose him without hesitation. And for the first time, she understood what it meant to lose not just a man, but an entire future. There was no screaming, no scandal, just a silent pain that took over every part of her body. In that hallway of books, among pages that spoke of new beginnings and endings, Emma understood. The betrayal she committed wasn't just against the man who loved her. It was against everything they could have built. And that was a story that neither time nor forgiveness could rewrite. Emma remained still for a few seconds even after Noah disappeared among the shelves with little Liam. Her body was there, but her mind was already in another time, another place, where perhaps she had made different choices, spoken different words, listened more attentively to the silences. The bookstore, once so familiar, now felt like a strange setting, as if she were observing her own life from the outside, a spectator of something that no longer belonged to her. Her hands still trembled, and she felt a pressure in her chest that wasn't just sadness, it was a kind of emptiness that darkened even what remained. She didn't cry there, not in front of him, but carried her tears to the car, to the steering wheel, to the rearview mirror where she saw the face of someone she no longer recognized. The following days dragged on as if time had lost its rhythm. Emma tried to move on with her life, but nothing seemed to have purpose anymore. Places were empty of meaning, people were distant, and even small pleasures seemed dull. She tried to maintain her routine, but every gesture was a reminder of what was no longer there. She had long since stopped expecting messages from the other man. He had left her life as lightly as he had entered, without promises, without guilt, only with the coldness of someone who had never intended to stay. Emma now carried the awareness that she had not only lost Noah, but had lost herself along the way. That light, creative woman, full of plans and tenderness, had transformed into someone who now avoided mirrors and slept with the television on so as not to hear her own silence. One rainy afternoon, she decided to visit the house where she had lived with Noah. The house had been sold, but she had learned from an acquaintance that the new resident hadn't moved in yet. It was empty, awaiting renovations. There was something about it that drew her back, as if some fragment of who she once was still there. Upon arriving, she asked the caretaker to let her in for a few minutes, saying she needed to retrieve something she had left behind. The man hesitated, but seeing the look of sadness in his eyes, he relented. The key turned in the lock, and as she pushed open the door, the familiar smell of damp wood and time invaded her. The walls were bare, the furniture gone, but the air still carried traces of what had once been there. She walked slowly through the rooms, as if stepping into a past too recent to be forgotten. In the bedroom, the closets were open, empty. In the bathroom, the mirror still bore the sticker marks from when they'd posted messages to each other in the morning. In the living room, she found an envelope under the old bookshelf, folded, unmarked. Opening it, she recognized his handwriting. It wasn't a letter, just a list. They were small wishes. Plant lavender in the garden, replace the living room curtains with blue ones, buy the complete collection of books she loves, learn to cook mushroom risotto the way she likes it, play the piano for her once a month. Each line was a gesture of love never revealed. Things he wanted to do for her, small promises he waited for the right moment to fulfill. Emma fell to her knees on the floor, as if the weight of that paper were too much to bear. He still loved her as he wrote that. And she didn't see it. She didn't want to see it. Or maybe she chose not to believe that someone could love her so delicately. Noah, at that very moment, was moving his life in a different direction. He had found a silent love in his new partner, without grandiose speeches, but full of presence. Liam, his new wife's son from a previous relationship, had become an essential part of his routine. It was in the small moments that he felt the new beginning was worth it. In the mornings Liam would jump into bed with a smile, in the coffees shared with sincere smiles, in the plans that made sense again. He hadn't forgotten Emma. That wasn't the kind of love you forget. But her memory had become something else, no longer an open wound, but a lesson he carried with respect. A reminder of what was and what could no longer be. It was a few months later, at a literary event, that they met for the last time. Emma hadn't known he would be there, but seeing him on stage, presenting a reading project for children, something inside her calmed. It was no longer pain, nor regret, but acceptance. When he finished, he came down amid applause and was greeted by dozens of people. She waited until they were alone. She approached with a shy smile, and he, upon seeing her, showed no surprise. He simply smiled back politely. They chatted for a few minutes, cordial. She asked about Liam, about his books, about life. He responded as calmly and kindly as ever. Neither of them mentioned the past. There was no need to. Emma then took a deep breath and said she needed to be grateful. That, as painful as everything had been, she had learned to see herself more honestly, and that, ironically, it was his love that taught her this. Noah simply nodded, without interrupting her. She continued, saying that for a long time, she believed she could go back, fix things, erase them. But now she understood that time doesn't restore what we abandon. And, looking into his eyes, she added, you taught me what true love is. And I will never forget that." Noah held her gaze for a moment. There was a pent-up emotion there, not of longing, but of respect. And then he replied, "I loved you as best I could. And even after everything, I hope you find someone who sees you whole." Emma smiled, her eyes brimming, and for the first time in a long time, she felt peace. Not because she regained what she'd lost, but because she finally understood what she'd lost. And accepting that was the only way to move forward. They parted with a light touch, no hugs, no promises. Just two paths that, for a time, had crossed powerfully, but now headed in different directions. Emma left the event with a lighter heart. There were tears, yes, but there was also relief. Life was still hers, and now she knew it. Noah returned home to find Liam waiting for him on the porch, a book in hand. He sat beside the boy and began reading aloud, as he did every night. His wife appeared at the door with a cup of tea, watching them both fondly. He looked at her and smiled, a full smile, without a trace of pain. In that moment, all was at peace. Emma, alone in her apartment, put on some soft music and began painting, an old hobby she had taken up again. Her hands were stained with paint, and her eyes, for the first time in a long time, were unfocused. They were steady, focused on what she was building. She was no longer the same woman who had lost her way on the sidewalks. She was someone who had learned to face her choices with courage. And although she still bore scars, she now knew they were not a sign of weakness, but of transformation. And so, without grand endings, their story found its truth. Not all love is forever. But all true love leaves marks that time cannot erase. Marks that remind us that love is also knowing how to let go. And moving on, even with a heavy heart, because life doesn't expect us to be perfect, just honest. And sometimes, the only way to honor a great love is to respect its ending. Emma's departure from the event was slow, as if each step required an immense effort not to look back. The words they exchanged still echoed in her mind, not with pain, but with a kind of serene melancholy, as if she had finally understood that not all love that marks us is destined to last. The night air was cold, but within her was something even colder, the inevitable silence of loss that cannot be recovered. She sat on a bench in a nearby square and watched the people come and go, feeling strangely out of place. As if the world had moved on and she was still sitting in the same chair where everything began to fall apart. For the first time, there was no anger, no exaggerated guilt. There was only awareness. And awareness, when it arrives, is not noisy, it is like a mirror that clearly shows everything we have tried to deny for too long. In the weeks that followed, Emma plunged into a lonely and painful process of rebuilding. She joined a therapy group, started recording her thoughts in a notebook, and rediscovered the small habits that had once made her feel alive. Little by little, she tried to reconnect with the part of herself that didn't depend on anyone. And the more she delved into herself, the more she realized how much she had neglected her own boundaries throughout the relationship, as if she had lost her identity trying to fit into a space that was no longer hers. She no longer tried to get back together with Noah, she no longer entertained fantasies of returning. I had understood that loving someone doesn't give us the right to be loved in the same way. And that was the hardest lesson. In contrast, Noah was experiencing the opposite process, not of reconstruction, but of renewal. He felt whole for the first time in a long time. The lightness with which his new companion looked at him, the silent respect she maintained for his time, his space, his history, made him realize that peace can also be love. And that emotional security isn't monotony, it's home. With Liam, the connection was growing. It was no longer just an adaptation, it was a true bond. The boy trusted him, called out to him on difficult nights, showed him his drawings as if presenting something to his own father. Noah didn't need to force this place. He simply stayed. And in this staying, he built a space of love that not even blood ties could guarantee. But even with all the calm he had achieved, he was not immune to memories. Sometimes, a song, a recipe, a phrase lost in a book, would take him back to the old house, to the woman who had once been his world. Not with painful longing, but with an almost sacred respect. Because no matter how much he had been hurt, he knew that part of life was real. It wasn't a lie. It was love. But love also tires when it's not cared for. And he had chosen to live what came after the pain. He chose consciously, firmly, without revenge. Upon learning of Noah's marriage, Emma didn't break down as she'd imagined. There was sadness, of course, but not the kind that tears you apart. It was a more mature pain, like someone watching the final scene of a movie and knowing that, no matter how much they hoped for a different ending, this was the only one possible. The name of the woman beside him didn't matter. What mattered was his gaze, calm, complete, at peace. And that was what struck her most deeply. Because that serenity he carried now was the same one she destroyed when she thought she needed something more. In essence, she understood the moral dilemma she had experienced. And this dilemma consumed her silently, because understanding that we make mistakes isn't as difficult as accepting that there's no way to repair certain mistakes. She had been mistaken in thinking she could experience something intensely outside of marriage and still keep what she had with Noah intact. She discovered, too late, that fidelity isn't just about the body. It's about presence, about loyalty to what you've built with someone else. About not breaking what can't be put back together. He had learned all of this through pain, and now it was his responsibility not to repeat the same paths. That name, Liam, still appeared in his thoughts frequently. Not for the child itself, who was innocent of everything, but for its symbolism. It was the name he'd been saving for a possible child with Noah. And now, here he was, naming his new partner's child that name. Not out of provocation. But out of affection. And it hurt. Because it was the definitive confirmation that the future they dreamed of together had already been built, just with someone else. Emma, over time, learned to live with that memory without hurting herself. It was a scar, and like all scars, it still hurt on rainy days. But it no longer bled. One night, she received a call from a mutual friend, who told her about a social project Noah had created on behalf of the new family. A book club for children from dysfunctional homes. He gave lectures, collected books, and held weekly meetings. Emma listened silently, with a mixture of pride and melancholy. She didn't want to know any more details. She simply thanked him for the information and hung up. Not because she didn't care, but because it was no longer her right to care. She understood, then and there, that mature love also means knowing when to bow out with dignity. Noah, on the other hand, even immersed in a new reality, carried with him the wisdom of someone who had already experienced the fall. For this very reason, he kept his feet firmly planted in the present. He was grateful for what he had, cared zealously for his new relationship, but didn't delude himself with the idea of perfection. He knew that relationships are built every day and that any oversight can leave gaps. That's why he looked into his wife's eyes as if to say, "I'm here," even without words. Because now he understood that love isn't proven in grand gestures, but in small choices, made every day, even when no one is looking. One Saturday morning, Emma woke up feeling lighter. There was no specific reason. It wasn't a milestone, nor a new event. She simply felt an unusual lightness. She made herself coffee, listened to a favorite song, and opened the notebook where she had been writing her reflections. She reread some old passages and was moved to realize how much she had changed. There was still much to rebuild within herself, but she was no longer the same woman who sought solace in regret. Now she sought meaning. She wanted, finally, to experience something true, not as atonement for the past, but as a conscious choice for a new path. The dilemma she carried, between remorse and liberation, began to fade. She had understood that even without fixing everything that was broken, she could still build something new from the pieces that remained. This didn't mean forgetting, but transforming. And this transformation was her greatest redemption. Not before Noah. But before herself. It was the way to no longer be a hostage to her own choices. And it was in this slow, silent process that she found some hope again. She met someone, months later, unpretentiously. A serene man, without grandiose speeches, but with a generous ear. There was no urgency, no idealization. Just presence. Emma, now more attentive, more mature, allowed herself to take it slow. She was in no rush to love again. But she was also no longer afraid. She had learned from pain that love is not safe territory, but that it is worth it when built with truth. Meanwhile, Noah read stories to Liam before bed, wrote letters he never sent, and moved on, never looking back. Life no longer hurt. It simply moved on. Emma's presence had become a solid memory, like an old photograph kept in a box rarely opened. There was no longer anything that needed to be resolved. Just experienced. And that was the greatest symbol of peace one can achieve after a whirlwind, the absence of the need for further answers. And though each had taken different paths, there was something between them that couldn't be erased. A kind of silent gratitude for what they'd experienced, for the truths they'd learned from each other, even if the hard way. Because sometimes, the greatest form of love isn't insisting. It's letting go. It's not returning. It's wanting the other person to be happy, even when they're far from you. And now, after so much, there was only one last choice left to make. The hardest, the most liberating. A choice that depended on no one but themselves. And that choice was about to happen. Autumn arrived with a colder wind than usual, and with it came a different silence. Not the same silence that weighed heavily on two strangers sharing a house, but the silence after the storm, where calm isn't the absence of noise, but the presence of lucidity. Emma was beginning to understand that some losses don't empty us entirely, they reveal us. For months, she had tried to fill her days with activities, distractions, anything that would keep her mind from returning to where it hurt. But now, sitting in a cafe far from the center, with a notebook in her hands and a cold cup before her, she realized she was no longer trying to escape the past, she was learning to live with it. The leaves falling outside, the low murmur of conversations around her, everything indicated that life waited for no one. And she, though still in the process, no longer wished for time to go back. She only wished that, from then on, everything would be more real. That same weekend, she accepted an invitation she'd been putting off for weeks, an art exhibition at a discreet gallery in the old part of town. The invitation had come from Ethan, the serene man she'd met by chance in a bookstore weeks earlier, and with whom she'd had increasingly long and less superficial conversations. There wasn't love yet, not as she'd known it before, but there was space, listening, respect. Ethan was different from Noah, and perhaps that's why she felt safe with him. She didn't try to replace him, didn't seek comparisons. She simply relished the feeling of being able to be who she was, with all the layers and stories she carried. The exhibition was about reconstructions. Paintings that mixed fragments of torn works, pieces of broken frames, colors superimposed and brushstrokes that didn't hide the imperfections. As she walked through the gallery's corridors, Emma felt something align within her. Each work seemed like a mirror of her own journey, there was no attempt to hide the mistakes, but to integrate them into something new. She stopped before one canvas in particular, an abstract portrait of two figures that began connected but gradually moved away in opposite directions, until, in the right corner of the canvas, each continued with its own color. It touched her in an unexpected way. Her eyes burned, not with sadness, but with recognition. Ethan approached, looked at the same canvas in silence, and, needing no explanation, simply said that sometimes the most beautiful love is the one that teaches us to move on. Meanwhile, Noah and his wife were planning a short trip with Liam. It was an ordinary weekend, but he knew it was on these ordinary days that bonds grew stronger. They were organizing a trip to the countryside, where they could hike trails, turn off their phones, and just live. Life with her was simple, yet full of meaning. There was respect in the silences and affection in the smallest gestures. He no longer thought about Emma constantly, but there were nights when he dreamed of a version of her that only existed in the past, a version that still smiled at him wholeheartedly. Not with longing or regret, but as if memory were telling him that everything had been necessary for him to get here. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the garage, he found a notebook he'd kept during his marriage to Emma. Inside were sketches of projects that never came to fruition, recipes, birthday ideas, travel plans, doodles she'd made when she felt bored. He read a few pages and then closed the notebook calmly, unhurriedly, painlessly. He went upstairs to his room, put the notebook in a smaller box, and took it to the neighborhood library. He discreetly placed it among the donated books, as if handing something back to time. It was the last piece he needed to let go of. That same night, Emma dreamed of a deserted beach. In the dream, she walked alone on the wet sand until she found a version of herself sitting on a rock, looking out at the sea. As she approached, she heard the other version say, "You no longer have to carry what no longer belongs to you." She woke with ragged breath, but feeling a new relief. She started the day by calling her mother, something she hadn't done in weeks, then texted Ethan saying she'd like to see him later. When they met, they were in a park. They sat in the shade of a tree, and she began to recount, with rare honesty, everything she had experienced. Not in cruel detail, but with the sincerity of someone unwilling to hide wounds. Ethan listened to everything without interruption. In the end, he simply held her hand and said he wasn't afraid of the broken pieces, as long as she was willing to build something real, in time. Emma, for the first time, felt that perhaps she deserved this new beginning. Meanwhile, Noah received a call from an old friend who, upon hearing about the reading project he had started, wanted him to write a column about effective fatherhood. He initially refused, saying he wasn't a writer, but she insisted. And after thinking for a few hours, he sat down at his computer and began typing. The column spoke of non-biological love, of bonds built in the silence of everyday life, of teaching someone to ride a bike and learning about courage at the same time. When he finished, he realized he had also written about Emma, even without mentioning her. Because it was from her that he learned the importance of care, of gesture, of presence. Even though everything was over, it was with her that he became the man he was today. The publication appeared on a small circulation website, but it touched everyone who read it. And among those readers was Emma. She stumbled upon the text one night while searching for articles on affectionate parenting. When she recognized the style, she knew it was his. She read it slowly, line by line, like someone drinking something rare. When she finished, she closed her eyes and smiled. She didn't cry. She didn't feel pain. She felt gratitude. Because now she knew that, despite everything, there was something beautiful that remained, the way they had become one another. Shortly afterward, at a local coffee shop, Emma and Noah met again. It wasn't planned. She was leaving with a bag of books, he was walking and holding Liam's hand. Their eyes met, and they both smiled. The wait was gone. Just two adults who had survived what wasn't meant to last. Liam stepped forward to grab a pastry, and Emma watched him fondly. Noah, noticing, made a subtle gesture of acknowledgement, as if to say, "Thank you." She approached and asked how they were. They spoke briefly, unhurriedly, without tension. When she said goodbye, she bent down to Liam's level and said, "You're lucky to have this guy by your side." He smiled and replied, "I know." Noah looked at her and simply said, calmly, "I hope you too find someone who knows the value of what you carry." Emma walked down the sidewalk, her eyes brimming, but she didn't cry. It was another tear this time. Of acceptance. Of liberation. Of someone who was finally ready to experience something new, without any pending issues, without ghosts. She was no longer the woman who had made mistakes. She was the woman who had learned from them. And that, in itself, was a fresh start. Noah watched her walk away for a few seconds, then entered the coffee shop with Liam, who was already excited about his new books. And there, in that small space, between one cup and another, between past and present, each of them silently understood that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. And that some stories, even when they end, continue to teach long after the final point. Spring brought with it a new light, softer, clearer, as if the entire city were breathing a little more easily. The streets were ablaze with flowers, the cafes filled up again in the late afternoons, and there was something in the air that seemed to whisper discreet new beginnings, almost imperceptible, but present. Emma walked more lightly, with firm but unhurried steps. She wasn't the same woman who had silently said goodbye to a destroyed love, nor the woman who had tried to hold on to what she could no longer hold. Now, there was maturity in her eyes, a serenity built not from victories, but from well-digested losses. The relationship with Ethan didn't continue, not for lack of affection, but because she understood that she still needed time, needed to look at herself honestly before sharing her life with someone else again. And that didn't sadden her. It was a choice. For the first time, a choice all her own, free of guilt, free of the urge to patch herself up with someone else. She returned to live in a smaller apartment near a cultural center where she volunteered with women who, like her, had lost themselves trying to please others. She painted on weekends, wrote letters to herself, and, above all, kept peace as a priority. For the first time, he wasn't trying to save himself through someone else's love. She was learning to be enough for herself. On the other side of the same city, Noah lived his daily life intensely and silently. His reading project had expanded, now involving schools and community visits, and there was a line of volunteers wanting to participate. He wasn't seeking recognition, but he felt deeply grateful to see something so simple touching so many lives. Liam was growing fast, full of questions and a curiosity that demanded creative answers. Their relationship no longer needed proof or guarantees. It was a real bond. It was love learned through practice. His wife, always present, was a silent pillar, someone who didn't need to occupy every space to be indispensable. With her, life was more contained, but full of presence. No scenes, no peaks, no gaps. Just constancy. And, after all, that was exactly what he needed. But life, with its subtle irony, doesn't say goodbye without leaving a final mark. At a closing event for the year's reading cycle, Noah was invited to speak. The auditorium was full, parents, teachers, volunteers, children. Emma was there. She didn't know he would speak, but she was invited by a colleague from the cultural center. When she recognized him on stage, she didn't look away. She sat in the last row and listened to every word. Noah spoke of new beginnings, of love that rebuilds itself in unexpected ways, of losses that transform us. He didn't mention names, didn't tell his story. But each sentence carried the weight of a lived truth. Emma didn't cry. She just closed her eyes for a few seconds and allowed herself to feel proud of having loved him once, even if badly, even if wrongly. It was strange, but beautiful. As if their past had finally found a resting place. Finally, the two met in the hallways. There was no overt emotion. Just a discreet greeting. An exchange of glances that said more than any conversation. He asked if she was okay, and she answered yes, sincerely. Emma said the speech was beautiful, and he thanked her, also truthfully. She then said, almost in a whisper, that she hoped he was happy. And he replied yes, but that happiness wasn't the destination, it was the way one chooses to walk. They smiled. And that was it. No hug, no long goodbye. Just two paths that crossed for a moment and continued on, without hurt feelings, without haste. Time passed. Emma published a book with illustrations and short autobiographical texts. She received invitations to give lectures, but chose to remain in small spaces, in real encounters. One night, when asked by a young woman how she had overcome such a profound betrayal, she replied that the first step was accepting that forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about herself. He said that some scars don't heal to disappear, but to remind us where we shouldn't bleed anymore. And that her biggest mistake wasn't betraying someone, it was betraying herself in the first place. The audience fell silent. Someone wept. She didn't. She had already made peace with everything she couldn't be in the past. Noah, meanwhile, was surprised one Sunday morning with breakfast prepared by Liam and his wife. The boy, now older, held a handwritten letter thanking her for choosing him as her son, even though she wasn't obligated to do so. She said she loved him more than words could say and hoped, one day, to be half the man he was. Noah read it silently, then looked at them both and said that, despite all the pain he'd experienced, he would never trade his journey. That every loss, every tear, every heavy silence had brought him to this point. And that, in that moment, there was no more pain, only fulfillment. It was the end of a cycle. And the beginning of a lifetime of peace. If you've made it this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave a comment sharing your opinion, your feelings, your interpretation. This story was created to touch, to provoke reflection, and to remind us that behind every choice lies a weight that can change entire destinies. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage and subscribe now. Here, you'll find moving, confronting stories that show the real consequences of human decisions. This story taught us that betrayal isn't just a moral failing, it's a silent destruction of affection, respect, and emotional security. It's a chasm between two hearts that once promised to care for each other. And when that bond is broken, there's not always a way back. Cheating is breaking an invisible pact, it's hurting someone at their most vulnerable point, trust. And rebuilding that, when possible, requires much more than apologies. It requires maturity, time, truth, and, above all, a lack of ego. May this story serve as a reminder that love, when true, must be nurtured every day. That the peace of a relationship lies in the details, in the small gestures, in the daily choice to stay. And that losing someone who truly loved you can be one of the cruelest regrets to bear. The channel emphasizes that it does not support any type of betrayal. Here, truth, respect, and loyalty will always be the foundation. Until the next story.